Greetings to our dear viewers. Welcome to the first Uganda Coffee Platform podcast that is going to look at the EUDR and the CS3D. My name is Samson Emong, working with the Secretariat of the Uganda Coffee Platform. I'm joined by Mr. Rent Pakema, who we're going to have a discussion on this interesting and fascinating topic. As a country and as an origin, we first came to interface with this in January 2023, where we had the EU delegation from Brussels visit and explain the EUDR and the CS3D, what it entailed, and potential consequences in regard to how we work in the coffee value chain. So today, with Rent, we're going to try and have a discussion and just take you through it in learning and understanding what the CS3D and the EUDR are all about. As we begin with the corporate sustainability due diligence background, I'd like to invite Rent here to just give us a bit of perspective on what CS3D is all about.
Thank you, Samson. Good day, listeners. The background to all this is that we all realize that enterprises, any company, contributes to economic, social, and environmental progress. We've seen that, for example, in Uganda, when the coffee sector was liberated. We saw that it really launched an enormous activity in the coffee sector.
That's correct.
Many companies came up. The coffee sector has benefited from that liberalization and the private companies getting into that space.
Yes.
On the other hand, I think it's important to realize that we do know that enterprises, companies have detrimental impacts on society if they don't get their act together. And some of the things that we're all very much aware of, these are health and safety issues, it's issues about labor, there's issues about environment, greenhouse gas emissions, and even corruption and bribery that can be fueled, advanced by companies.
And Rent, it's important to note that we actually know of some of these examples. So this is not something that we are plucking out of the sky.
Sure.
We actually know it has happened as a result of moving in this direction.
Very true. And of course, governments and consumers alike are increasingly concerned about some of these adverse impacts of an unregulated private sector in any space, not just the coffee space.
Yes, that's correct. So we move on to the definition. How best would we define the CS3D for someone who's working in the value chain and has not totally internalized this concept?
Well, I would like to start explaining that the CS3D, the due diligence, is a requirement by companies, by enterprises. Forced upon enterprises by either voluntary or mandatory processes. But basically what we want enterprises to do is to identify, prevent, mitigate, and account for any possible adverse impact they may have on as a result of their business operations. What we want in CS3D, what we as consumers and governments require from companies is to take care of all these issues and show that they are operating legally and responsibly and ethically.
And when we say we, it's important to note that we're meeting all of us as citizens on this planet of different countries. We should all want this to ensure that our environment is protected, that the rights, our individual and human rights are protected. It's just a best practice of, I guess, humanity in that regard. So that's what you mean when you say we. So to further get into this and give a bit of perspective, I thought it is important to look at some of the standards in regard to the human rights and environmental due diligence. Could you share with us some of the voluntary standards, for example?
Yeah, so this discussion itself is not new. Corporate sustainability due diligence is 10 to 20 years old. Citizens, governments were not happy with the progress made under these various guidelines that existed. And so legal frameworks were increasingly put into place. Member states of the European Union, Germany, the Netherlands, had made laws for companies to comply with these OECD standards, for example, and human rights standards. Now, what does that mean? It means that if you are exporting coffee to the Netherlands, you are bound to different rules than if you're exporting it to Germany.
Correct, yes. So, what's fascinating, and one way of looking at this, dear viewer, is that they prepared us with voluntary standards. It's almost, you can say there was foresight on the fact that we should have expected this because we were given the foundation of what was coming. And the mandatory standards, as Rent has indicated, we might not have done enough because it was voluntary, but this is definitely the direction that the whole world is going into right now, and it's expected.
Yeah, so I could say that what the European Union is trying to do is to for companies to help companies to deal with a single legal framework,
Yes.
rather than dealing with the Netherlands and Germany and Spain.
Multiple countries.
Yes. Slightly different legislation, slightly different requirements. Yeah,
Yes.
they've said, why can't we put this all together into a single legal framework
Yes.
that then means for a company that imports into the European Union, you know what to expect, irrespective of where you take your product.
Yes, that makes sense. Thank you for that. Now, this slide, I wanted us to give our viewers and listeners perspective into the basis of the international and local conventions and policies and laws. And the objective is to give you an insight to Rent's point that this is not something that is being imposed on us. They are actually examples, both internationally and locally, that supplement and validate the importance of such a legislation and directive. So, Rent, could you share with us some of the international ones, for example?
Well, I just put up a few. These are just a few examples. If you would go into some of the legislation that is at this moment available, you could read a long list of international agreements, conventions that we've all signed up to. Of course, the United Nations Declaration on Human Rights, the International Labour Organization Convention on minimum age, but also on other elements of workers' rights, for example, political rights. I would like to mention here also, because it's underpinning the EUDR and the CS3D, the Paris Climate Change Declaration of 2015,
yes.
Extremely important. And there's around the environment a whole series of international conventions that we all actually have signed up to.
It's important, Rent, that we actually agree with it because we're not forced. You went to the table and you signed these agreements because you believe in the concept and the principle.
Absolutely.
As stated, yes.
Absolutely, yeah.
Then some local examples for our viewers and listeners.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're all aware that Uganda doesn't operate in isolation, and there are lots of things that we have tried to make clear as citizens of this country in our own laws and policies and strategies. And I just put up a few. The Uganda Vision 2040, for example, very clearly indicates the adherence to human rights, according even to the UN Declaration on Human Rights. So we are fully embedded in our own legislation, these international agreements and conventions. All the things that you find in the various declarations and conventions that are internationally agreed are somehow embedded in all these local laws.
Yes, and to that point, before we move to the next slide, I would like our viewers and listeners to try and Google the Forest Policy and Act and NEMA Act. We have a habit of not knowing some of these things, including myself, but it's fascinating at some of the legislation. That's why they say as a country we have some of the best policies, well written and well researched. So yes, get an opportunity, please go and look at them. So in our next slide, now we'll really go to unpack it. We want to look at EUDR in its totality. And Rent, could you share with us, based on what you've already talked about and just giving perspective, what is EUDR in short?
Well, thank you, Samson, for that question. In actual fact, the EUDR is a simple piece of legislation. It basically says that you can only put some agricultural products, coffee and cocoa are two of them, on the European market if they are produced on land that was not deforested. Secondly, these products need to be produced in accordance with the laws of Uganda. And thirdly, the batches that you put on the European market need to travel with a due diligence statement that claims that the first two conditions have been fulfilled.
So let's start with trace, let's start with operators, trace, and plot of land. Those are the three words I want us to discuss. Operators, you mean?
An operator is somebody who places a product on the European market.
Okay.
So an operator in our case would be an importer.
Yes.
So a buyer of an exporter here in Uganda.
Okay. And trace?
Tracing means that you would be able, for every step that product, let's say coffee, moves from a farm
Yes.
to a bicycle trailer,
Yes.
to a hulling factory, to another truck or holding company, to an exporter's factory, that when it arrives in the exporter's factory, actually when it comes out of the grading machine on the other side,
Yes.
you would still be able to see that it came from this particular plot of land.
Fascinating. But plot of land is the one I want us to unpack. Why plot of land?
The point here is that we are talking about deforestation. And deforestation is not linked to a person or a factory, it is linked to a plot of land. A plot of land is either deforested or it is not.
Oh, that makes sense. So, what is deforestation free? Because that was the first point that you highlighted. Could you help us unpack what deforestation free really means?
That a commodity is deforestation free if it is produced on a plot of land that didn't have forest on 31st of December 2020. So it's as simple as that. So we have a cut-off date. All the coffee, for example, or cocoa or any other product that was grown on a plot of land
Before 2020.
or planted on that plot of land before 31st December 2020 is per definition, under this rule, deforestation free. So a land use map comes into play in order to prove that that coffee was planted on that plot of land before the cutoff date.
Then let's look at what deforestation is. Deforestation is the conversion of forest to agriculture use. Now, this has been one of the most contentious elements of this legislation in terms of truly understanding. Could you help us unpack it?
Well, what is important to realize is that this is about agricultural products. So the deforestation here is turning a forest into agriculture use, in this case, into coffee cultivation.
And that is very important because you will hear a lot of our colleagues say, but do these guys understand that there's urbanization and all that? Again, it doesn't matter. Nothing to do with roadworks, nothing to do with human settlement. The EU is only strictly interested when it comes to agriculture use. And that is an important point that needs to be made very clear to a lot of people beyond even the coffee sector.
True. The EU says if you bring coffee into the European Union, make sure that it is not grown on deforested land. Okay?
It's as clear as that. So we could move on to, we can continue to do what a forest is in this sense.
Yeah, I don't want to dwell too much on it, but there's a clear definition of forest, and that comes from the FAO. Number one, a forest, an area of trees, obviously, must be bigger than an acre. If it is smaller than an acre, it's not under the definition of being a forest. And it does not necessarily need to be a natural forest. So you can plant pine or you can plant eucalyptus. Once that is being planted, it is bigger than half a hectare, so roughly an acre. It's considered a forest. Yeah.
Wow, fascinating. Yes.
And it is not including land that is predominantly under agricultural urban land use. And that, for example, means agroforestry systems, for example. So an agroforestry system is not considered a forest in this definition.
So how will the EUDR due diligence be conducted? Because with all this legislation, how will we know that we're being compliant?
So what does the private sector is expected to do? It is to collect that information in order to be able to trace your product, in this case the coffee. So detailed information about what is the product and where was it produced. That's where it starts. Yeah. It also, because that coffee travels through the value chain from the plot of land all the way up to the exporter's container, in order in the container to know that you are deforestation free, you must be able to trace that coffee through the supply chain. The second thing that you need to do is to carry out a deforestation risk assessment. So if you are harvesting or buying coffee or exporting coffee from Greater Masaka, you must know how big is actually the chance that there's something going on here which is not in compliance with the CS3D. So you have to make that risk assessment.
Yes.
If we advise, therefore, that we should enlarge our coffee plots, we need to keep this in the back of our mind. Are we expanding coffee into areas that would fall under the...
so the risk assessment would inform that sort of next step. in that
Yes,
regard.
and then you start taking mitigating risks.
Yes.
So at that moment you say, hey, wait a minute, yes, we would like to get more druga from Runzoris, but let's be careful how we advise our farmers to do that.
Yes.
Yeah, because otherwise that entire lot might be excluded from EU market. Now, in order to prove that you've done this, you need for every lot of coffee that you export, you need to have that due diligence statement, which is, this is the coffee, it's so much, it came from here, and I can prove that it came from there, etc., etc., etc. Yeah?
Yes, and that's how we get over the line in regard to that statement. We could move on to the next one. What is important to note, I think, for our viewers and listeners is the timeline. We hinted at it previously, but it's very important for us to emphasize it. Could you share with us where we are currently in this roadmap?
It came into force in June 2023, as you can see here, and there is a grace period of about 1.5 years for big companies, large-scale enterprises, what you see here.
Yes.
And again, this is about importers. So if you are a large-scale importer, you would need to comply with this by January 2025.
So basically, this is for the buyers of the Ugandan coffee.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Yes. So the importers in the European market. For smaller companies, again, this is not a small company here, but a small company in Europe
yes.
that buys coffee from here. They got half a year extra up to July 2025 to comply with these requirements that I showed in the previous slide.
Okay, thank you very much for that. So the next slide, we would like to look at the CS3D. And as Renji indicated, it's still at proposal level. Could you take us through where we are with what the CS3D is? What is it? Where we are with it? Share with us the material scope of the CS3D for perspective to our listeners and viewers.
Yes, I mean, I think it's important to realize that CS3D is different from EUDR. EUDR is very specifically on forests and deforestation. This is a much broader requirement from companies to make sure that they have a sustainable and responsibly managed supply chain.
Yes.
Yeah, so it's a much broader piece of legislation. It is broadly based on international agreements and conventions.
And it might continue to grow.
The second element on the CS3D, as I just brought up, is that the business strategy must be in line with the Paris agreements and takes all the necessary steps to become carbon neutral in the near future.
Yes.
Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense in terms of the material scope. Now let's look at the company scope for the CS3D, which you hinted to when you earlier were showing us the roadmap in terms of the timeline.
It's about importers in the European Union market.
Yes.
But the importers in the European market will, of course, ask the information that they need in their due diligence statements from their suppliers in Uganda in this case.
And the suppliers here, we're talking about the exporters and the traders who export out of the country.
True, because as you will see, the importers will need to understand their entire supply chain, all the way down to the producer.
Yes.
Yeah, and that means that for that company, they would say to the exporter, "Can you tell me where you source your coffee from? How is that factory managed? How is the price distribution along the value chain?
Yes.
And is the producer also producing sustainable coffee?" Yeah, and then elements of human rights, etc., come in that whole story as well. So basically, it means the importer asks the question to the exporter, and the exporter will now need to check in the supply chain that everything is correct.
Understood. That makes a lot of sense. And the point where you underline direct and indirect business relationships, the indirect is what we're talking about. That is the Uganda coffee supply chain. That is the exporters, that's the traders, that is the processors, all the way to the producers.
And the importer cannot say, well, what you do as an exporter in your supply chain is of no concern to me.
Yes. CS3D, just like EUDR, what do the next steps and timeline look like?
Well, Samson, you understand that the proposal is still in development, but they've gone quite far, and we expect it to be ready by 2023. There's an extra step and that is where this differs from the EUDR, and that means that it has to be included in the individual member states' legislation. And then it only becomes legally enforced in the European Union individual countries.
What do you think would be the turnaround time for such an exercise? Because I don't know how many member states there.
27.
27. That's a lot.
That's a lot.
What do you think is the turnaround time, and how would it affect the eventual implementation of the CS3D?
So you have 2 years as a member state to pass it, to turn it into a legislation of your own country, and then get it through your respective parliaments. So you could say if we have this thing done by, let's say, early 2024, you can add 2 years, that's 25 and 26, yeah, before it comes into force into any of the member states. This is then maybe a little bit of relief to our listeners. 2026 would be fast. 2027 is probably a more likely year where this thing starts to bite.
More realistic.
Yeah.
So what the opportunity here is that gives us as a coffee sector to be able to clean our value chain and ensure that we are moving on the right track. Not because, again, it's very important to note that we're not talking about doing it because of the EU directive or legislation that will come. But I think as an industry, as an enterprise, as a value chain, even as a society, it is the right thing to do moving forward.
This is not something that only happens in the European Union. We see similar legislation being passed by other large importers. So we need to be careful to think that, okay, then we'll go and sell our coffee somewhere else.
Yes.
Leave alone that the European Union is a very big market for our coffee. You don't switch markets that easily.
Yes.
But be aware that these other markets will follow suit.
Very soon. So we've shared a lot. So how do we comply?
We could be working together pre-competitively to get some of these compliance things done. And I just put up a few ideas that are generally accepted. Information sharing is important.
And it's important to note that in this pre-competitive space, we understand that not all businesses are at the same level. There are those who have tools and practices that are already advanced more than others. And it will be important to share even with your own competitors because it serves the purpose collectively.
True, and we do need to make a little distinction here between the international companies and the local companies.
Yes.
The International Trade Center did a survey here in Uganda looking at how prepared the different exporters and traders are, and we find that the international companies are more prepared in terms of CS3D. I'm not talking about EUDR and the tracing and traceability. Usually taking ideas from their headquarters, international headquarters, or their importers, and you find that the local companies are lagging behind.
Yes, and that's a very important concept or facet to understand in terms of moving forward and finding a sustainable solution to this.
Yeah. So basically, if you look a little bit further down this simple list of working together, if you have a supply chain and you know your traders or your hulling factories where you buy from, some of the ideas and some of the processes and principles that you apply in your own company could be taken down to your suppliers. And that could even go as far as organizing seminars and trainings in your supply chain. Bring your traders together and talk to them and say, these are the basic things that we want you to do in future in order for that coffee to be sold in the European Union. Yeah.
Yes.
Around that, of course, I want to emphasize also the importance of the awareness, the general awareness. Samson, you were sharing with me some ideas flying around that this is all to damage the coffee industry and what have you. What's your view on this?
No, I mean the media is going to play a fundamental role. What is important, especially for people who work in the coffee sector, is that this legislation and directive do not become populist views or propaganda or something against us. As a Ugandan, and I've been very honest in our different forums that when originally it came in January, we were all in shock and we were a bit defensive. But the more you read, the more you attend meetings, the more you understand the concepts and the principles behind this, you first and foremost understand that it is in the best interest of the country, let alone the value chain, and it's the direction it's supposed to take in. So working together means that we need to get the right information to the media because of the reach they have. to avoid and demystify any populist and propaganda information that might distort our ability to achieve what needs to be achieved as a coffee sector. So, and that's also a role that civil society needs to play in, and that's what we're very passionate at as the Secretariat of the Coffee Platform, because we understand its importance.
Talking about the Secretariat of the Coffee Platform, I see here also on the slide the CS3D and EUDR task force. Could you explain a little bit more what this is all about?
So the task force is something that was agreed upon by the coffee sector to take this thing forward in terms of how do we become compliant. So its composition involves the government and the private sector. And as you might have heard at the annual stakeholders meeting, we're trying to take this issue to be national. So it's not just a coffee issue. Because think about it, the way we are moving, that anything that is being exported to the EU bloc will face the same scrutiny and compliance related issues. So this task force is supposed to help us generate. It is co-chaired by both the Uganda Coffee Development Authority and the Uganda Coffee Federation through different representatives. And our hope is that we shall be able to create a media campaign or awareness campaign. We should be able to share information, but most important, an action plan that can inform strategy and key next steps, whether they are financed publicly or privately, especially when you look at issues of traceability, you look at issues of registration, and even the CS3D, what will come under it in terms of sharing different tools and information to be embedded in different private companies.
Now, if I'm a company and I want to pick information or I want to contribute to the task force, how do I get in there? Where do I find information around this topic, and how can I influence how the task force operates or what I want the task force to do?
Yes. So for now, we should be able to reach Cafe Africa as the Secretariat and the Uganda Coffee Federation. We shall do the representation in terms of the Secretariat role, and we'll be sharing our email address at the end of the slide. You could be able to reach out, but also be able to reach out to the Uganda Coffee Federation, which is the oldest umbrella organization for the private sector, especially exporters, the traders, and farmers. And yes, we should be able to intake any informations and requests and see how it can inform the task force moving forward.
Some other element, of course, especially important for the EUDR, but eventually it will also be a mandatory on the CS3D, the Value Chain Operators Registration. Could you say something about it?
By law, UCDA is required to register value chain operators. And that particular law came timely because it was not based on the EU legislation. So some of the things that are required under the CS3D and the EUDR is to have that registration in place, have a system and infrastructure ready, and then a rollout system and time frame that, of course, it's not yet clear.
What I see is a difference here between a registration of value chain operators on the one hand and
Yes.
a traceability system on the other hand. And I think it's important that we make a distinction between the two.
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. But how do we effect the traceability? Because the traceability is largely, at least as understood by me and I guess by you as well, is it a private sector driven concept or system? So how is it achieved? Because the private sector cannot use individual traceability systems. It's not an efficient way.
So what solution do we have?
I guess we're going to find out. We need to go to the next slide to continue this discussion. Yes, and a value chain traceability system. Now, one of the options on the table, and this has been manifested from the discussions we have had in the last 4 or 5 meetings, most of the members have indicated a single countrywide traceability system from farm to exporter.
You could outsource that and have it in a single company that has the responsibility, or entity, it's not necessarily a company, has the responsibility to make the system work for the entire industry.
Yes.
And it could actually be self-financing.
And those are some of the questions and the discussions we're going to have in the task force.
Exactly.
Because just earlier this month, we're able to listen to the Uganda Coffee Development Authority present a registration system, which was very clear, and also presented a traceability system. And it begged a lot of questions that we need to continue to discuss so that we make the right decision from the onset.
I think the best thing to do is to have a stakeholder consultation and probably bring in some high-level consultants who understand this much better than we do and say what options do we have and which option would work for Uganda. And
Yes.
what cost implications
What are the
does
cost
it
implications? Yes.
for it as well.
And it's important to know that with the cost implication, it requires that money it needs to be financed in a very, it can't be wait. You can't wait. It works every day, so it needs to be financed continuously, not a break in. We don't have the luxury. The particular exporter shared with me and says, when we have the coffee being quality assessed, there are fees, penalties they have to pay if the coffee doesn't get in time to the vessel. Doesn't go to the port.
So it has huge financial implications.
It has huge financial implications for the business. Businesses that can collapse overnight because of such penalties. So if we move to, how do we address the differentiation and CS3 challenges within our supply chain? What are some of the recommendations you would give our listeners and viewers?
Well, I mean, we said that this is a private sector issue, but of course, the government of Uganda has a role to play in handling issues of deforestation and other CS3D challenges in the supply chain, because in many cases, these constitute violations of Ugandan laws.
Correct.
Yeah? So if somebody expands in Mabira Forest a coffee farm, that person is breaking a Ugandan law.
Yes.
If somebody enters into a national park and plant coffee, or in a forest reserve and plant coffee, that person is breaking a national law, not an EU law. I think that's very important. The same thing is true for things like child labor or health and safety in factories. And there actually the government has a possibility. For example, the hulling factories are being licensed by UCDA,
Yes.
and that license can contain or should contain and probably does contain these type of requirements. You
Yes.
must operate that factory under Ugandan law.
Yes, that makes a lot of sense. Moving on swiftly to our next slide. What does the Uganda Coffee Platform do to support this industry?
Well, maybe the first example is that we sit here and try to explain it to
Yes.
everybody. And we are open for more questions. What we're trying to do is to kind of provide as much information as we can get. We sit in seminars, online discussions, we read documents, etc., etc. So that, of course, will be pushed back into the kind of podcasts and discussions that we have and put online.
And most importantly, we'll try and work, for example, with the Uganda Coffee Quality Traders and Processors Association.
Absolutely.
That works with the factories to be able to have such information and different tools and practices to make sure that it becomes easier.
And translate it into practical interventions for the entire industry.
Yes, and lastly, which has been the oldest function of the platform and as a secretariat, is to ensure that the channels of discussion between government and private sector continue. As we indicated, the Uganda Coffee Development Authority is prepared to take this to cabinet and make this a national issue, as was communicated by the managing director at the annual stakeholders meeting. So once again, I would like to thank you very much, Rent, for having joined me on this podcast of the Uganda Coffee Platform to talk about the EUDR and the CS3D. Please would like to get your comments on it. Feel free to send feedback if you need more information, where we could improve as well, so that we can see if these podcasts are useful to explain beyond just reading on the PowerPoint presentations that we share with you.